Where banks are silent, we speak. A podcast by You Mushroom.
Dear community, welcome to our podcast series, What Your Bank Doesn't Tell You. Today, we have the big pleasure to talk about a precious metal, focuses on silver, and we have a very special guest here, Dan Dickson, who is the CEO of Endeavour Silver. Endeavour Silver is a Canadian developer and miner, so the company is engaged into discovery, development and mining of silver, a very innovative and highly sustainable miner. Dan, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Dan, I'm sure our listeners would be thrilled to understand a little bit more about Endeavour Mining.
Yeah, I mean, we're a Canadian company with operations in Mexico. We've been operating in Mexico for close to 20 years now. We produce 8 million silver equivalent ounces. We just made our first purchase outside of Mexico for an operating asset now in Peru. That's going to add about 5 million silver equivalent ounces. And we're building our Terronera project. Our Terronera project is another 7 million ounces. So we're going to grow from 8 million silver equivalent ounces at the beginning of 2024. By the end of the year, we'll be annualized 20 million ounces silver equivalent, bringing our cost structure down. And ultimately, we have more growth behind that inside our company already.
This is incredible. Endeavour Silver was founded in 2004, and the company is listed on New York Stock Exchange and Toronto Stock Exchange, if I recall correctly.
Yeah,
incredible. What is the amount of silver ounces which you currently produce? Just to put it in perspective for those of our listeners who are not so familiar with.
It's very dynamic this year. So we have our Guanaceví and Balanitos mines. That's the legacy mines that we built the company off of. That's going to be between 7 to 7.9 million silver equivalent ounces annualized. As I said, we just bought the Minera Copa mine. It's in Peru. On an annualized basis, it's 5 million ounces. If you take 8 months of the 12 months for this year, it's probably about another 3.5 million. So we're going from 7 to 8 to basically 10 to 11 million silver equivalent ounces. The other aspect of 2024 is, when does Terronera come online? Terronera is 7 million ounces silver equivalent per year. If we start commercial production in July of this year, you can add another 3.5 million ounces on top of that. So 2025 is going to be very dynamic.
Wow.
It's depending on really when Terronera comes in, but you're talking about close to 13 million silver equivalent ounces for 2024.
That is actually quite a huge,
sorry.
That's a huge jump in production, right? Which you're expecting. Incredible.
Yeah, it's been a year of change, a lot of work. We were very excited that we could bring Copa in. We would have loved to have done it after Terronera was in operations. We've been delayed about 3-4 months at Terronera, but it's all coming together. It's going to be a good summer, and if we get to where we expect to get to, it should be very good for our shareholders.
Incredible. A step back for those of us, our listeners who are not so much familiar with the silver market in general. Let's start with a very basic question. Where is silver used typically? What is the use of silver?
It's the industrial use of silver has changed dramatically over the last 15 years. We've seen massive growth in solar panels. So it's gone from about 80 million ounces used 10 years ago to about 240 million ounces in 2024.
Wow.
Electric vehicles, cell phones, flat screen TVs. Silver is the best conductor of electricity with the least amount of thermal heat loss. So ultimately in our small gadgets where we don't want it to heat up, that's where they use silver. So it's really difficult to actually recycle silver from that. And it's been an explosion as we go through electrification, greenification, reducing our carbon footprint in the world. We'll be using more and more silver. So this industrial usage of silver has grown exponentially over the last 10 years.
What is the current world production, would you say? Let's say.
It's been very flat, shockingly, over the last 15 years. In 2010, we produced about 800 million ounces silver globally. Today, 2025, it's still about 800 million ounces of silver production comes out of mines. Now, in our world, we're a primary silver producer. So that means most of our revenue mix is made up of silver. So for Endeavour Silver, we're 60% silver, 40% gold. With Copa coming online, we'll fall to maybe 50% silver, gold, and now base metals, zinc and lead. In the world of the 800 million ounces that we produce out of mines, 30% comes from a primary silver mine.
Yeah.
So that means 70% is coming out as a byproduct, either out of copper mine, gold mine, a polymetallic resource. So it's a very scarce commodity to be able to invest in from a mining standpoint. They're hard to find. People want bigger silver mines, but it just doesn't come like that in the earth. So again, it's always deemed to be a byproduct from other mines, and it makes it a very interesting metal to try to invest in and understand.
Indeed, and what is very interesting, and we keep hearing that in a lot of research articles, and particularly in the talk you gave today, production is by far not meeting the demand needs, right?
Yeah.
Would you elaborate on that? How big is the discrepancy, and is that expected to sustain in the next years?
Yeah, there's studies done by a group called Metal Focus. It's funded by the Silver Institute. I'm a member of that Silver Institute. They've shown that there's been deficits now for 7 years, and that deficit definitely oscillates. It's a function of the industrial demand growth. So again, solar panels, electric vehicles, the use of silver in electrification, that has grown, and the mine supply has stayed flat. Now, jewelry, coins, investment in silver has stayed relatively flat lately. In 2010, there was a mass explosion in investments in silver. That was because of debasement of currencies, deficits and debts, the financial crisis from 2008. In our world today, silver has been trading as industrial metal. There's going to come a time it's going to trade as a precious metal again. We've seen gold make all-time highs, sitting just below $3,400 today.
Silver is far beyond that, right? We used to have around $50 per ounce, I remember.
Exactly. So $50 was the high in 2011. We're sitting at 33. The silver-gold ratio over the last 35 years, the average ratio is 65 to 1. Right now, we're sitting at over 100 to 1.
Yes. And it's expected probably to divert.
Yeah, it's any cycle of metals. So ultimately in 2008 to 2010, 2011, during that financial crisis, the ratio got down to 32 to 1. So silver always lags gold. We can go back through history. Silver lags it, catches up, and then overshoots it. So it's a lot more volatile than gold.
It's true, yes.
Makes it interesting and fun at the same time, sometimes difficult. But I think that opportunity is really setting up well for silver right now because of that ratio being over 100 to 1. If it just comes back down to 61, you're talking about making all-time highs in silver, blowing through that $50. And I think that's coming in the next year or two.
That's amazing. And would you say also from that perspective, we see on one side a huge demand for silver, demand growing from the dynamics of different industries.
Yeah.
On the other side, production being relatively flat.
Yeah.
How quickly can production accumulate? Because we know that there is a period of time until a mine is from the discovery of a mine into full operation, right? So
absolutely. And Mexico is known as a good jurisdiction, go from discovery into production. Our Terronera mine was discovered in 2013. Here we are in 2025, 25 years from discovery to commercial production. And that's the expectation. Sometimes we go through lulls in the market. So the silver price got down to the teens. We weren't pushing Terronera forward. So in Mexico, maybe you can get a mine from discovery into production in 8 years, but you do have to build up that resource. You have to do all the studies to make sure it's economically viable, because you're making a big investment, upfront investment. You need to know you have that rate of return. What's happened in the mining space, especially the precious metal space, there's been a lack of capital coming into our space for whatever reason, but that capital hasn't been making it down to the juniors, who are the ones that normally make those discoveries.
Interesting.
So we have a big gap coming as this demand increases. Where does the supply come from? As I said, from 2010 to 2025, silver supply has been flat.
Wow.
Right? So as we're using more and more, these deficits are coming. We're going to see either a price increase, which is more likely than not, or we're going to find supply. And as you say, it's not easy to bring supply on, and especially for silver. Silver's, again, 30% comes from a primary silver mine. So you almost need copper to take off for silver to come from a copper mine as a byproduct. So it's not necessarily for silver, it's not necessarily dictated only by the silver price. It's sometimes dictated by the other metal prices and whether those are at high enough levels to bring other mine supply on for copper or gold, lead, zinc, whatever have you.
That is very interesting and sheds some light on the dynamics of the production and the production cycle of silver effectively. Something which would be also very interesting for our listeners would be to understand the revenue model, cost and revenue model from a typical mining company. And why I'm asking that is because very often from investor perspective, and our listeners typically have this investor perspective, what would happen, we would love to understand to what extent 1%, let's say, in silver price increase would correspond to certain price increase of the stock price of miners.
Yeah,
so let's start with.
There's a bunch of different metrics that you can measure that from. If you go back through the history and the beta, so ultimately the movement of share prices on that, there's definitely a correlation. For us, 60% of our revenue comes from silver, 40% comes from gold. So if you're talking about a 1% move on both silver and gold, it's really easy calculation.
It's going to be 1% increase
exactly.
of the...
plus taxes. So you got to take that taxes off. Hopefully you're in a profitable situation. Ultimately, there's more leverage to it. So if you have a margin, a very tight margin, so a high cost mine, that 1% is going to give you exponential growth compared to a low cost mine. Sometimes, and in our past as Endeavour, people have bought the Endeavour shares because we had higher cost mines. A lot more leverage to that growth price in silver because your margins are multiplying compared to a low cost mine. So that beta changes depending on the company and the characteristics of the company. For us, because we're 60% silver, generally a 1% move to our bottom line and then use that bottom line, whether it's a cash multiple, a discounted cash flow, so a NAV multiple of how you're determining what that company value is. It always changes, but we use NAV multiple, so the profits and the cash flows discount it back. A 1% movement for us, generally in silver, translates in our share price almost 3 to 1.
Wow.
Just because of the leverage, the ounces we have in the ground, et cetera, et cetera. Now, as Terronera comes online, our margins get a lot higher, so that 1% movement won't have as dramatic effect on our net income. But of course, we like higher prices, and we always want it to go higher. It makes it easier from our standpoint operating.
That's incredible. Yeah. Would you elaborate about the cost structure of Endeavour? Be interesting for us to hear.
Yeah, we're different than... There's two types of mines: open pit mine, big equipment, big capital investment up front. Underground mine, still big capital investment up front, a lot more labor costs. So 33% of our costs is tied to labor. We have close to 3,700 employees now with underground mines. So Kolpa, Terronera, Guanaceví, and Bolañitos are all underground epithermal vein systems. Our next highest cost is power. And I think that would be generally for most companies, power or diesel costs for open pits. But for us, it's labor, then power. Steel costs, we use a lot of steel with underground ground conditions, steel balls in our plants. And then at Guanaceví, our fourth highest cost is cyanide. So reagents used in the process to separate the metals from the rock. And then after that, it starts dissipating. So those four costs for us, reagents, labor, power, and steel are our biggest costs, something that we look at closely.
Interesting. Yeah. And on the revenue side, would you elaborate on what are metrics a typical investor should look like when you look at a miner in silver?
Yeah, there's a lot of things you got to look at. From a revenue side of thing, it comes down to grade. So what is the grade of the material that you're mining? Obviously, higher grade material is easier to make that profit off of. But sometimes grade alone isn't enough because it comes down to widths of that deposit. So a vein that might be only 30 centimeters wide but has higher grade compared to a 20-meter wide vein with a slightly lower grade. I'd rather have the 20 meters with the slightly lower grade so you can get your cost per ton down. So it changes everywhere, but grade is king. Grade is what you look for first.
Okay.
Yeah. And then it comes down to continuity, widths, accessibility. So how close is it to surface? If you have a high grade deposit that's wide, but it's 3 kilometers below the ground, it makes it very difficult to get it out economically. So that's what makes mining so great, is there's so many variables in each deposit that make it specific for each deposit, that there is thought and engineering that goes through it that makes each mine specific, has specific characteristics that makes what's going to be profitable or not.
Very dynamic and a very optimization-prone process.
Absolutely. Always trying to make that analysis. Then you've got changing prices all the time, and that impacts sizes of ore body, what you're mining, other areas that you can go to. So it's dynamic and makes it fun.
Super interesting. Who are your biggest clients?
Our biggest clients, matter of fact, we actually don't know. So we produce out of Guana City a doré bar that we turn into 99.9% silver, and we sell that onto the London Exchange. And ultimately, it's a commodity, so we don't know.
So
who's
you're
selling
producing
that.
the commodity and delivering
Goes
it to
through the
stock
exchange.
exchanges.
We don't know on the other side of it. Our concentrates, so out of Bolañitos and Terranera and Culpa, we sell a concentrate, so a high-grade mud, so to speak. Those go to smelters. The smelters separate the gold, the silver, and what other metals are in there, and ultimately they make that sale. In the silver world, everyone always asks me, who's the largest user of silver?
Yes.
Funny enough, we
Classical
always
question.
hear it's Dow Chemical. So they use it in chemical reactions, and they actually recycle a lot of their silver through those reactions. We've been hearing about solar panels and the use of solar panels in China.
The armor industry today, we
Yeah.
heard in our talk, and particularly Leon mentioned that was super interesting, that there is worldwide 2.7 trillion expenditures
On defense.
on defense.
Yeah. And ultimately,
What percentage goes to silver? But sorry.
yeah, but ultimately that's all the electronics going into it.
Yes.
So silver, as I said, is the least loss of heat from silver. So it's the best conductor of electricity. When you got these very small parts that can't heat up or they fall apart, you need silver. And that's the growth from the industrial standpoint. And it makes it difficult to know who the end users are because you've got supply chains where things are getting made in Taiwan or China or United States, and it all comes together and maybe makes the iPhone. So you've got all these different manufacturers, and at the end, it ends up in Apple's product, but you don't see who the actual silver buyers
Yes.
are or enough of it to actually go, oh, they use the most amount of silver. So we know solar panels is the largest use of silver from an industrial standpoint, but there's multiple different solar panel companies out of China. So it's a very difficult and opaque market to really see.
Super interesting. And for our users, our listeners, definitely super interesting to hear. Who are the biggest countries producing silver?
Yeah, so 800 million ounces of silver are produced a year. Mexico's 25% of that. So that's 200 million ounces come out of Mexico. China's number 3, it's near 100 million, and then Peru is behind that. So we're now in Peru, so we're in the largest jurisdiction with Mexico, we're in the 3rd largest jurisdiction with Peru, and it just dissipates after that.
Super interesting. It's very, very fascinating market. What is your prognosis for silver prices end of 2025 and end of 2026?
Yeah, I don't get into that a lot.
Okay.
So right now we're at $34. I will say that silver to gold ratio, gold's making all-time highs. The history for silver was $50. If we just get back to the 65 to 1, which is the average over the last 35 years, I think we'll make all-time highs in silver, and I think that's coming. So hopefully by the end of the year, we touch 50 or go through 50.
That's interesting.
Timing's always difficult. There's so much going on, geopolitically, tensions, tariffs out of the United States. It's just a very uncertain world right now. It's hard to figure out what direction we're going. I think it's shaping up very well for silver. Just you never know the timing.
Of course, this is super difficult, but the trend is in the right direction.
Absolutely.
And it's upward pointing, and this is, I think, what matters also for our listeners. One final question, which would be also to make this whole mining world more tangible. When you pick up a mine, what are the stages in which actually a mine developer goes through? Like, from scouting it, discovering it.
Yeah.
We just recently read you announced that you're actually starting wet commissions in
Yeah, I mean, you can get into a lot of detail. I mean, ultimately, you got moose pasture, just a clear field, which is called greenfields exploration. You also have brownfields exploration, is when you're right beside a mine and you're drilling around that. It's some of the easiest exploration, if you can call it easy, is brownfields exploration. But you have exploration to development to operations. From development, there's so much that goes into it. You have early economic assessments where you do very high-level engineering. And then as you get deeper and deeper into those economic assessments, you move from kind of a PEA to a pre-feasibility study, then into a feasibility study. At different levels, you have different levels of engineering as well. And even after a feasibility study where you've gone through high-level engineering, then you get into detailed engineering. Mistakes get made along the way. You learn things along the way. And as you go and you start to build, you build your mine, you're coming in, and we're coming into what now we had pre-commissioning. So before we introduce water, before we introduce ore into the plant, we call it pre-commissioning. So turning everything on, checking to see if it works without anything inside the ball mills, the SAG mills. Then we introduce water, which is wet commissioning, and with the water, we start introducing ore. So at Terronera, we started the crushers and the ball mills and the flotation circuit in November, December of last year. We had delays on our lower platform, which is our concentrate filter and our filter press. That's the end of the plant. We just started putting water through the filter press. So now we can say, hey, we're wet commissioning from crushing all the way down to the filter press, which ultimately those filters get put on for us, a dry stack filter dam. So it's very complicated. I could spend hours talking about it.
I can imagine.
And there's detail at every level. So what makes mining kind of incredible, and like a lot of industries, you have your accountants, lawyers, and with mining engineers all the way down to dump truck drivers and scoop operators, safety people.
It's a very real business. It's a very tangible business.
Very tangible. It is a primary industry. We've been doing it for thousands of years.
Yes.
It continues to evolve. The technology that we're using nowadays is advanced significantly over the last 20 years. We're starting to see AI help us with exploration, AI help us with engineering. So it's still evolving, but then it still comes down to moving rock and moving dirt, which is what we've been doing for thousands of years. So it's dynamic, it's fun. There's days it's incredibly frustrating because you're in remote locations and you need things done fast. Like I say, it's fun, interesting, and frustrating all at the same time.
Amazing.
Yeah.
And Dan, one last final idea, thought, which you would love to share with our listeners?
Oh, geez, you put me on the spot.
Something spontaneously on your mind?
No, I just think right now we're in a very interesting world. Ultimately, for silver and gold, which is what we produce, I think it sets up extremely well. I think us as a management team has set up Endeavour extremely well. We've got a lot of growth coming. We have an asset behind Colpa and Terronera called Pizzeria. It's one of the world's largest undeveloped silver deposits. We've got 600 million ounces defined, plus zinc and lead. It's also in Mexico. We're looking at it from an underground standpoint. As we get Terronera into production, hopefully here in the next 3 months, and we've integrated Colpa, our focus will be on Pizzeria. Our goal is to be a 30 million ounce producer before this decade's out, which puts us as a senior silver producer. There's not a lot of primary silver mines or silver companies out there that you can count them on both hands that are of significance to shareholders. So like I say, I think we're in a great spot as a company. I think the silver market's in a great spot, and I don't have any spontaneous great thoughts.
That is great.
But I think about the company, so.
Wonderful.
That's what I can give you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the very insightful talk and for you being with us today and sharing all your knowledge and experience from this fascinating industry.
Thank you. Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much. For those of you who have questions, you're always welcome to write us at hello@umushroom.com, and we're looking forward to welcome you in our next episode.
Where banks are silent, we speak. A podcast by You Mushroom.